So there we go. So really happy to have everybody here. My name is Brad Tabke. I live in Shakopee, and we have grew up on a farm in Northwest Iowa. We've got two daughters. We're here in Shakopee. My wife is a teacher here at the high school, and I have worked in landscape and real estate projects all my life. I have a bachelor's in horticulture from Iowa State, and so I owned a landscape maintenance company for a long time. And I am really excited. The last couple months have just been, I was telling some folks before we got started here that last year with COVID really reinvigorated, I guess is a good way to say it, reinvigorated my love of gardening and being outside and doing things. And the last few years with my work, I haven't been doing as much of that kind of thing. And so it's been really great. And I've had a lot of folks this spring who are asking me a lot of questions and wanted to talk about gardening and wanted to also got involved with gardening Facebook group and just been answering lots of questions on there. So we started this little gardening club, and this is part of it tonight, where we're going to go through and talk about different issues and what's going on in gardening specifically for Minnesota, because a lot of the things that you see online and see that you Google are just not correct for where we are and who we are here, as well as just a lot of wrong information out there as well. And there's a lot of opinions as to if you should be fully one way or another and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to cut through it all and talk about things that are important. So if anybody has any questions or needs anything, please just pipe up and chat. We're recording this for our garden club members so that they can watch it into the future and that kind of thing. And then we'll go from there. So I will get this started. If nobody needs anything, we'll turn the screen share on here. All right, can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Was that April?
No, that's Jade.
That's Jade. All right. Thanks, Jade. I didn't get to talk to you earlier, so it's great to have folks here. But today we're going to talk about jumping worms and grubs and Minnesota garden pests. And so we'll take probably, I don't know, half hour or so to maybe 45 minutes. If you guys have questions or you need anything, just make sure to ask questions if there's anything that you've got that you want to talk about. And then from there, we'll do question and answer. If there's any questions that you've got about things that are going on in your garden right now, we'll take it from there. Think of it as kind of, if you watch Care 11 at all, Bobby Jensen is a good friend of mine. We're going to Bobby Jensen this without the Santa Claus factor to it. So today we're going to talk about jumping worms, grubs, and Minnesota garden pests. So the first thing is jumping worms have gotten a lot of media now, so I don't know if people have really looked at that or seen or heard that, but it's a lot on Facebook, and there's a lot of fear with jumping worms, and there's a lot of concern about it, and a lot of it is very rightfully so, that it should be that way because it's a nasty invasive worm from Asia. It is really, really destructive, especially to native forested lands. And it can be in landscape settings. You don't see them too much in landscapes yet. That's not where we see them, but they have potential to be moved around. And so those are some of the things we're going to talk about with the jumping worms today. So they're very different from earthworms. They look similar, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But with it, they are earthworms. They are really genuinely great for the soil. They do a lot of tilling of the soil, and they help aerate and get water down into places. But these invasive jumping worms, they stay in the top couple inches of the soil, and so they don't go down deep at all. So they just really obliterate the soil, the root matter, the leaf matter that's on the ground, especially in forest areas and mulched areas and that kind of thing. And they first were documented in Minnesota back in 2006. There were some in Illinois back in 2003 was the first time they were recorded in the Midwest. And so they have a very different pattern of moving. So if you want to identify if you have an earthworm or a jumping worm, their method of motion is what's really an important way to tell the difference between the two. And so they move in a snake-like manner is one if they're just going. So they do this. So they move, this is 40 seconds long, and so they move along like this. And so this is an earthworm. It's from Asia. And if you haven't seen any videos of these, they're pretty gnarly. And so then when you touch them, they kind of go crazy. And so they do this pattern. They start to jump around, and they don't like to be touched at all. So Elliot, you weren't far off with kerosene. But they are nasty dudes for sure. So they're really ugly and gross, but what they do is they go into the soil and they really just ruin the soil. And so if you're walking on a slope in a forested area where they reproduce like crazy, and so where there are heavy infestations of these jumping worms, what happens is that they lose all the soil structure, and so you can step in it and the soil will just fall out from underneath of you, which then also the roots fall out from all the trees and those kinds of things, and there's no way to keep that soil structure in place, and so the plants begin to die, and there are major issues that way. So they reproduce heavily and reduce the soil to a consistency that looks like coffee grounds, or some people say it looks like cat litter. Here's a little up close of it as to what it looks like, but that's the soil castings. And so they get just tons of these jumping earthworms in there, and they just ruin a soil area. And so they're pretty nasty. But this is a really good picture of the band around the ring around the earthworm on these jumping worms are pretty different than what you see on earthworms. Earthworms, they're more the same color as the rest of the body. They're kind of positioned differently, and they're on jumping worms, they're really flat with the body, and they don't really stick out at all. So there's another picture of that light colored ring as to how you can tell the difference between a normal earthworm that we like here in Minnesota and the jumping worms there. And I just realized with the Zoom, I have I can't see if anybody has raised their hands or anything. I don't believe. Here we go. Pulled that up, so we're good. So I'll be able to see if anybody raised their hands and wants to talk or anything like that. So we are in good shape if you have any questions. So then with those, the jumping worms, they really start to thrash around and go crazy, like you kind of saw in that photo, the video earlier, when they are attempted to be handled. This is a video from the Wisconsin DNR, and brace yourselves for it. They are crazy. And then it's pretty funny in this video how in just a moment they'll show a slow-mo of a worm jumping out of the dish. There it goes. Couldn't live the rest of your life without seeing the slow-mo worm jumping, but that's where that is. So the way you identify differences between the jumping worms and the earthworms are here. So you can see how earthworms that we like, it's a raised ring band called a cotellum that's around there. And then the jumping worms are a lot more streamlined, and they are thinner generally, and that band is level and even with the skin on the worm. And so that's a really important way. But the life cycle of these guys is what is really kind of problematic with everything, is that the worms themselves, they can't live through the winter in Minnesota. So the worms don't live through the winter, but the eggs do. So these are the cocoons, pictures from the U of M of the cocoons. So the worms die, but their eggs survive through the winter. And so you can have these eggs that are in soil, that are in a potting mix, that are somewhere there, and they can be transported around without having any worms present, but the eggs are present, and they are prolifically reproductive. And so that's one of the big problems with these, is you need to make sure that everyone's being vigilant and paying attention, especially in the fall, because the worms mature in the late summer and early fall. And so that's when they do all their damage. So people need to be watching for that type of damage during those months. So this is a comparison. So you got cut off here. So I'll just fix that while we're here. From August 9th of 2020, the green places are where it was identified in Minnesota. It was first identified down here in Red Wing. And then March 3rd of 2021, just a year, 6 months later, there had been a significant number more of sightings of this Asian invasive worm here in Minnesota. So it's going around a lot. And so the U of M is going to do some major programs this fall and a lot of media and different things around it for when it's active, when you can identify it, to be looking for it and find it. So here in Scott County, where I'm at, has not been found yet, but Carver County, Hennepin County, across the river, it has been found in multiple locations. It's also been found in multiple forested locations as well in the state. And so that's a major problems for things. And Jesse, lucky for you, it hasn't been identified in northern Minnesota yet, but it's just a matter of time with things. We'll talk about how we can prevent this from spreading here. So they are first believed to be introduced into the Midwest through fishing bait. So they're worms for bait, and they're evidently terrible bait as well. So the bait that we've got, when you try and use them, they fall apart. And so they're really weak. The rings on them are really weak. And so they fall apart and don't work really well as bait. But they were believed to first come in as bait. And so now they are moved around mostly by when mulch and soils get delivered and those kinds of things, and also in plant material. And then when there are heavy infestations, there are a lot of predation that comes in. And so birds and different things can take and move them around also. So it's a big problem that way. So that's the way that it spreads primarily. So if you think about like emerald ash borer, which is something that we've worked so hard on here in Minnesota to keep it from moving around, but emerald ash borer is moved primarily by firewood. And so that's how they think that this is normally going to spread, is by plants being moved and by mulch and soils and different kinds of things like that. But there are things that we can do to make sure to hopefully keep that at bay. So the number one thing with jumping worms is to make sure to focus on prevention of the movement of the jumping worms. And so making sure that in the fall, late summer and fall months, we're being really careful to be scouting out our landscapes and to be looking around to make sure that we're not seeing a ton of that, the coffee grinds look in the soil, that everything is staying healthy and those types of things. And so prevention is the key for moving these things around, for keeping them from being moving around and identifying it early. And so it's once an infestation has occurred, it is really difficult to stop it from there because they do reproduce so much. And so with that, if you are looking for it early, you can find it and you can get the worms, because it just takes a few worms to make a big impact on a small area. And so with that, as long as we're looking and trying to identify when things are a problem before they take hold, we're okay. And so it's not at this point whatsoever as that we shouldn't be buying mulch, or we shouldn't be buying soil, or we shouldn't be doing anything like that. It is still contained enough at this point that those kinds of mitigation efforts are not necessary. We just need to be vigilant on looking for issues and hoping to contain them before they come up. And so that's a really important thing there. Just see what happened here. So it is a really good prevention. Sorry, I just got a chat from somebody here. So we are in good shape. So with there, the big push that the U of M and the DNR is working on this really hard is that this fall they are putting together a program for looking in your yards, for going and visiting woods and for going and looking for infestations of these jumping worms to see exactly where they've spread, where they're going, what's happening that way. So there will be a training that they'll be doing, and they will you can become a U of M host site for the worm. I forget exactly what they're calling it, like worm challenge or something like that. But I put a link. Hopefully everybody got the email that I sent, and with that, that email has the class workbook kind of thing that I put together the deck from the slides, and on those are links where you can use that and get to it. All those, everybody who's on here is a member of the gardening club. That link we'll be having on our membership site as well. So it's a good thing, but just making sure to check your garden for worms, make sure to check all new plants, soil, compost, and mulch for the jumping worms before you plant them and put them in. So it's a kind of a best practice is to, if you get new soil or if you get new mulch, to let it sit for a day on, if it's bagged, it's really probably not going to have it because they shouldn't be able to survive bags. But if you get bulk kinds of things, let it sit for a day so you can check and see if there's any activity or if there's anything's happening there whatsoever. So that's another good practice to have. So this is the Jumping Worm Project. That's what I should have said. That's the project that they're calling it. But if you see any evidence of jumping worms in forested areas or in the landscape, in parks, anything like that, report that identification to the U of M. So it's a really important thing to do. So that's what we've got on jumping worms so far. So it's a really important issue that we have, and we need to make sure that we're working on it here in Minnesota, but it's not something to be fearful of, to, you know, not do landscaping or not get a hosta from a friend or something like that. It is something that we should continue moving forward and continue doing things the way we've done them, just to be a little more vigilant about it. So Naomi asks, how can we identify worm contaminated materials in the spring when it's just the cocoons, like in plants and soil? And so you're totally right. It is difficult. So these are really small. So they're going to be pretty much impossible for people to be able to see in the spring and in that time of year. But what we need to be making sure to do is having all of and there's a concerted effort going on with the DNR and with MnDOT right now, not MnDOT, with U of M right now, for in the fall, making sure that when they're active and when you can see them, to be checking all the plant material, if you're checking piles of mulch and piles of soil and those kinds of things, so that once they, to identify that if there is any active adult jumping worms there, because you obviously need the adults in order to get the eggs and the cocoons for the spring. And so it's not widespread enough right now whatsoever in order to have a moratorium on moving dirt or anything like that. Like we have a moratorium on moving firewood to keep your emerald ash borer at bay. It's not like that at all yet, but it's an active invasive species that we are working on to make sure that we are trying to control it. So the goal on here is to identify it before it gets moved around. And so all nurseries, all garden centers, so making sure that you're buying soil and making sure that you're buying plants from reputable sources and making sure that you're doing the due diligence that way, so that they will have checked all that soil in the fall before it comes to you, and that mulch in the fall before it comes to you in the spring, and those kinds of things. So that's the plan there. Is it going to be 100% perfect? Absolutely not. But is there the chance of getting jumping worms at this point is so small that it is probably not going to happen. Does that help, Naomi?
Yeah, thank you for asking for a response. I'm just confused. So we're in St. Paul, and there have been several reports recently in our our nearby neighborhoods of people finding jumping worms. And it seems like the residential plant swapping is actually extremely high risk, because people are swapping plants in soil and it's not visible if you can see them. So I'm just our impression so far has been that that's actually extremely risky, and we wouldn't even consider bringing in anything like that to our yard.
And we're begging our neighbors
not
not
to. We're begging our neighbors not to, and we're facing a lot of pushback, but it just seems like bringing in something like this that could have real implications for not just your garden, but your neighbors' gardens. That just seems a little discordant with what I've been hearing.
Yes, and you are, and I'll clarify there, you are 100% correct that if you are in a neighborhood where there is an issue with this, and there are a known issue of things going on as well, this swapping of plants back and forth between neighbors and things like that is going to be one of the highest risk moves with jumping worms, especially if you know that they're somewhere in your neighborhood and that kind of thing, because they can spread, like I said, from if a robin grabs one in a neighbor's yard and comes your direction, it can come to your house without you knowing it. So if you know you have infestations in your neighborhood, absolutely do not be swapping plants with neighbors. Don't be doing that. That's why it's really highly recommended for plants to be coming from reputable nurseries and those kinds of things, because the nurseries, when you get a plant from there, 99.9% of them don't have any organic, what's the best way to say it? Like, not natural soil. It's all pre-made soil that's all been heat treated, and it gets rid of all the viruses, gets rid of all the things. It is very low likelihood that anything from a nursery plant stock that direction will come with anything at that point. And so that's thing. The other recommendations for if you are going to get, a fern or a hosta or an astilbe from a neighbor, that kind of thing, you want to make sure to wipe off and to leave. So if I'm going to your house, Naomi, and you have just this, what do you have? What's your favorite plant that you've got right there that you want to split?
Well, I don't do that, but let's just say a hosta, because that's a good example.
Okay, if you had a hosta that you really wanted to give away or that kind of thing, even though you won't because you know it's a risky activity in your neighborhood, but if you did and it had to happen, then what you can do is that these are different than earthworms, and they just live in the very top stratus of the soil. And so they're in the top couple inches of the soil. And so you can very easily take and move and remove that soil that's on the top and be pretty clear that that's not going to have any jumping worms that are moving around with that plant. And so if that is happening, then it's moving around. If that is happening, then you are able to reduce the exposure on that, is probably the best way to say that. But like I had, another good recommendation is just to do bare root material. So like this spring, a couple weeks ago, I split a bleeding heart in my backyard, and I screwed it up and basically lost all the soil off of it. It's still alive and it's doing super happy. But if you just have a bare root plant, there's no, you rinse that off, there's no eggs or anything like that's going to be coming with it. So those are mitigation attempts, but just continue doing what you're doing and keeping your neighbors from swapping plants, because eventually they're working on different sorts of more like we'll talk about Japanese beetles and grubs here, and they think different sorts of ways that jumping worms can be, that they're researching to get mitigation efforts that are different kinds of mitigation efforts that will work better into the future. We're just not there right now. Same way with how we release the little bees for emerald ash borer and that kind of thing. So Jade asks, is it too late to mitigate jumping worms if mature worms are found in your garden? Basically, yeah. If the only mitigation efforts are mechanical mitigation right now, and they're pretty difficult to do. So if you find jumping worms in your yard at any point, you won't start to see them for another month or so in general. So you'll start to see them in late summer is when you'll start to see them moving around and starting to disturb the soil. And at that point, it's mostly a dig through the soil before they lay their eggs. And so it's a dig through the soil and find as many of them as you can to keep them at bay, and to continue to reduce that population. Hopefully you get it cleaned out, but there's no great chemical treatment for them. There's nothing that has been proven to work well on them at this point. So it's that's why it's important that we keep them, like Naomi's doing, from spreading throughout different areas. Any other questions before I move on to some other stuff? And we'll be here for a little while, so we can ask more questions as we go forward. April asks, does the age of the plant affect how invasive the worms are? In other words, older plant, better survival rate. So the worms don't really affect the plant themselves specifically. The way that the worms affect and kill plants is by it removes so soil has soil structure. And so there are layers in your soil, which is why if you have a big garden plot or something like that where you use a tiller, you don't want to use a mechanical tiller more than once or twice on that garden plot, because then you eliminate that soil structure. And so you don't have the layers of soil that really keep those plants protected and that roots protected from erosion and from wind and from rain and those kinds of things. And so what these nasty jumping worms do is they turn that soil just into worm castings. And so there are so many of them in there, and they're so concentrated in that top layer. And most of the plant's roots are all in that top layer. And that's what damages the plants, is then they're susceptible to erosion, and then they start to weaken, and then it becomes problematic. So old plants, new plants, are going to have a hard time in those areas, but old plants will equally have as hard of a time. And so there are areas of the forest in Illinois that are just being decimated from a massive jumping worm infestation, that when their stiff wind comes through, the roots can't keep the trees in the soil, and so they just fall over. And so you just got giant root systems. I should have put a picture of that on here. You get giant root systems that are just up in the air from it. So that's it's affecting everyone equally from where their massive infestations are. M&D Office asked, what about soil under mulch? You planted something in spring, added mulch, now wonder about the jumping worm. How do you check the soil? So that's a really great question. And so the jumping worms also eat the mulch as well. So you will, if you have a bigger infestation, you'll see them with the mulch, but it's part of the training that people will be going through this fall is pulling back the mulch and really looking at the soil. So if you have hardwood mulch, part of the training that everybody will be going through is pulling that back and looking at the soil that's down there. And it'll have that different texture that looks like this. And you'll be able to see it pretty well as to what's going on. So if you have a solid good 2-3 inches of mulch on places, you'll have to pull that mulch back and look at the soil in order to see it. That was a great question. All right, any other questions on things? All right, so keep using the chat. That's perfect. That's working out well for everybody. And I'll go through a couple other dudes that I get asked questions about a lot in the spring. So I'll start moving on those now. And so a lot of people don't associate these two different stages of one life cycle with as nasty as they are for our gardens here in Minnesota and all over. But grubs that you find, especially in lawn care. So if you have grubs under the soil, under the turf, is a really terrible thing for a lot of lawn care. But a lot of those, the vast majority of those grubs that you'll find in lawns in Minnesota are actually the larvae for Japanese beetles. And so Japanese beetles are these nasty guys that come out in July, and they'll attack you. And I first ran into Japanese beetles. Like I said, I grew up in Iowa, and I did an internship in Chicago, and they hadn't really moved as much to Iowa or Minnesota at that point. But I was in Chicago, and I was under a linden tree on a golf course, and we were doing work there, and I was under this linden tree, and our uniforms for a landscape company, don't ask me why, but they were white shirts for this landscape company that I worked for. And so Japanese beetles particularly attack white things. And so these Japanese beetles were coming after me, and I had never seen them before, but they dive bomb. And so this linden tree was just covered in Japanese beetles. And for the first time, I was being dive bombed by these, and I had no idea what was going on. But I learned really quickly as to what Japanese beetles are and how much I hate them. And over the last decade or so, they've become a lot more prevalent here in Minnesota. And so the grub form, you won't really usually know that you've got grubs. You might just see some yellow spots or some dry spots showing up in your turf, but you really won't, especially if you have any irrigation, you won't know that you have grubs until you start to see something like this, because the birds and the raccoons and just the different friends will know that you have grubs first, and they'll go in there and try and find them for you. So if you ever see any ripped up areas in grass, it's because those animals are trying to get at the grubs, and you've most likely got grubs in your turf. And so they live, if you just take a spade and cut underneath that grass, you'll see lots and lots of them down there. And what those grubs do is they just eat those roots off that are right between the crown of the of your turf and then the root areas, and so they gnaw all that off, and then you've got turf that's not able to carry water nearly as well back and forth, and a lot of happy fat grubs that birds like to eat. So that's where the grubs come from. And so the life cycle on grubs and Japanese beetles is Japanese beetle larvae spend most of their time underground in this larval stage. And so they come out in June and July, and they lay their eggs back in the soil, and then their larval stage through the fall. And they don't really actually do much damage in the spring. They don't really feed a lot in the spring. Most of the damage gets done in the fall. So you start to see a lot of that ripped up turf areas in September and October at that time of year for Japanese beetle grubs. And so there are a couple of really good treatments for grubs that depending on your soil type, it will be sketchy whether they will work. But in Minnesota, we've had really good luck with it so far. And it's called milky spore, and it's a bacteria that only affects Japanese beetle grubs. And so it doesn't kill other types of insects. It's an insecticide that doesn't have a lot of harmful effects on other places. And so it's applied through the summer, and what is this bacteria that the grubs eat, and then the bacteria multiplies within the Japanese beetle grubs, and then they die, and they spread that bacteria over. And over the next couple of years, you start to get a lot more resistance to the grubs because you have a lot more of that bacteria in your soil. And so then it's a natural protectant, nematode against grubs. And so if you do have major problems, you can use a pesticide for it, but pretty much all the pesticides that you use to treat grubs are also highly toxic to bees and other pollinators. So we don't want to do that for things that way. So then next thing is if you go out for walks, if you have anybody has purple leaf sand cherries or other prunus cherry family trees in your neighborhood, you've probably seen tent caterpillars that are out now. And this is a picture I took probably 2 weeks ago now. There's along the Minnesota River, we have a really big natural area here in Shakopee that leads all through, and it's really awesome. And so I go to what's called the Louisville Swamp a lot with my dog, and so we go there often. And I saw a tent caterpillar for the first time, and so this picture that's on the left here, I went up and I was taking a picture, and I got kind of close up. And then all of a sudden I started feeling something on my arm. And this picture on the right was as I was up taking the picture, I didn't notice all the tent caterpillars had been down on the leaves down there, and they started crawling on my arm and freaked me out a little bit. But there was nobody else there to hear me scream much, so we were okay. But tent caterpillars are not terrible. They're really low on the list of things that you need to deal with landscape wise. And so they build this tent webbing area, and they go in there at night and they stay warm together, and then they come out during the day and they eat all the leaves. And so what you want to do with tent caterpillars, if you have them at your house, is you want to just wait for them to all go to bed at night, and then all I have to do is take a hose and spray them with a hose and knock them off. Vast majority of them will not be able to get their way back up to the leaf canopy, and they'll just go in the grass and they'll die. So tent caterpillars are they're not hugely detrimental to trees, but they are just annoying and gross. So if depending on what your values are and where you're at with things, you can deal with tent caterpillars however you choose. Aphids are something that you'll see start to see quite a bit, especially as it gets warmer. Aphids are giant pain to deal with, especially if you have any aphids in houseplants and different things like that. They're pretty difficult to deal with because they hide underneath of leaves and places where it's really difficult to get to here. And back up to Grubs here. Jade has a question about, could you comment on the effectiveness of milky spore applications if only one household in a neighborhood applies the product? So the milky spore will be very, very effective on the grubs themselves. So that will keep the grubs from affecting your lawn. If you're a turf person that really cares about how your turf looks, and grubs are causing problems that way, so they will absolutely keep all the grubs out of your turf. Japanese beetles don't fly really far once they get to the adult stage, and I'll do another one this summer before the Japanese beetles comes out to talk about Japanese beetle control. If you're the only one in your neighborhood doing it, and you have really difficult problems with Japanese beetles in your neighborhood, it's not going to affect significantly the population of Japanese beetles enough to reduce the population, but it would help the grubs. So that's where those two had. But there are mitigation efforts for Japanese beetles. They're really difficult, but we're going to have a whole class about that this summer. So you're on the email list now, Jade, so I'll make sure that you know about that when that comes forward. Did that help your question? Did I answer it the way you'd like? Or at least answer it enough? Not necessarily the right answer for what you'd like to have happen.
No, yeah, thank you.
Got it. Perfect. All right, so the next one is aphids, and aphids are, like I said, they're really difficult. They're you'll see a lot of times a green or spotting in different things on the leaves in different areas. If you have house plants, you'll see sticky things that are down on the pots or different areas like that from the aphids and from their excretion. And so the aphids are tough to deal with. If you get a massive infestation of aphids on a plant, one of the first things that you should do is to just hit them hard with water to try and wash as many of those off as you can into the turf areas. Aphids won't harm turf much at all because they don't have their mouth parts don't pierce turf leaves nearly as easily as they do stems and different leaf kinds of parts on broadleaf plants. And so spraying with water to get as many of those off as you can. And then if it still continues to be a problem, there are very mild insecticidal soaps that you can use to get rid of the rest of the aphids on there. And what you need to make sure to do if you're using an insecticidal soap is you need to cover the entire area. You can't miss pieces. If there's a leaf node that has a deep, depending on what the plant is, if you've got a palm tree or something like that that's out there in a container on your deck, they've got really deep crevices, and you gotta make sure that insecticidal soap gets down in there as well. So insecticidal soap is a really mild pesticide that works really well on aphids. It's just aphids procreate so fast that they're hard to get to. This is one of the grosser ones, so if anybody's concerned about grossness, you might want to avert your eyes here. But sawfly, is anybody familiar with sawfly at all? If you have any mughal pines in your landscape, if you have any bird's nest spruces, things like that, sawfly are pretty terrible on those sometimes, especially if they're older. Sawfly affects plants that are in decline more, and so when they're in the larval stage like this, they have a defense mechanism where all the sawflies they rear their ugly head, and oftentimes they'll do it in unison. This is not from Minnesota, but it's a very good explanation of what they do. And those little dudes freak me out. I don't like them at all. And it's just not, and it's just not happy whatsoever. And so sawflies are there we go. Sawflies are a really destructive plant. And so a really destructive larva stage on especially mughal pines is where you see them most of the time. And so the sawfly larvae, they fight back. And they cause significant destruction and damage to those pine trees. And there are different types of sawflies that affect broadleaf trees and deciduous trees and different things like that as well. But where we see them mostly in Minnesota is on mughal pines. And so they attack weaker, older plant materials. We had I had a landscape that we always took care of in Edina called Pentagon Park, if anybody's from the area and familiar with that. And they had a bunch of old Mugo pines, and the whole place, the building, everything was in decline there. But we did the best we could with duct tape to keep it all together. But they would always get sawfly in all those Mugo pines there, and it was really difficult. So with those, you can spray those off as well, but they're just lots and lots and lots of them. So usually you have to treat them with an insecticide to get rid of those. So that's sawfly. So that is all we've got for the different for jumping worms. So I hope you learned a lot about jumping worms, grubs, and different kinds of insects that are happening and dealing with things right now here in Minnesota. So as Jesse, as the season continues to work its way north, it will be affecting you. I think this time of year, most everything is about the same by where you are. Everything's caught up north, but we have, as I said, we have Minnesota Gardening Club, which has been just a lot of fun to have going. We've got members on here tonight from the Gardening Club. And so again, my name is Brad Tabke. We're down in Shakopee, and I have a horticulture degree from Iowa State, and have worked all my life in the landscape industry. Those are my two girls. Isla's on my shoulders. Jean is in 8th grade. She just got her COVID vaccine day before yesterday, and so that's really great to have. And my wife, Katie, that's at Blue Mountain State Park in southwest Minnesota down by Laverne, and it's great state park if you haven't ever been there. And you can add questions. If you have questions in the chat, just make sure to add those on there, and we will get to your questions here. But we built the Minnesota Garden Club for Minnesota gardeners, and so the plan is just a way to, as you look at Facebook groups and as you Google things, you never know if the answers are accurate. You never know if the answers are for our region and climate. And so we have this group that we put together for Minnesotans to clarify and distill information. And so it's we have new content every week, every month. Throughout the year on landscape, that's around 4 main things, and these are where we work on. So landscape, fruits and vegetables, lawn care, and then plant ID is the other one. So that's we're working on a lot of spring plants right now, and we are just getting it started. So we have a founding member program that we're working on. There's just $10 a month. The price for the founding members will never go up, and so you'll be at this price forever, and would love to have more people join us if it's something that makes sense for you. If this works best for you, then this is great as well. Love to help as many people as we can, but would love to have folks. So it's open for everybody around Minnesota. We're going to start next week. I'm going to start doing garden tours and videos about different gardens across the state of Minnesota. So I'm really excited about that and looking forward to it. So that's where we are there, and you can join at greppelymn.com/club. So that's on the notes as well for the class. So that's where we are. Who has questions? And it can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about, nasty grubs or worms that fight back. April, I know you're not that shy.
I was just kicking my daughter out of the room because she left her phone down here and it went off while you were talking, and I was just talking to her. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have some landscape rock that I just moved tonight. That was exciting.
How's your back going to feel tomorrow?
I don't know. We'll see. But no, I don't. This is very helpful. And my biggest question I had was about the transplant, sharing plants with neighbors, because that is something that I do quite frequently with friends and family. And I appreciate that map because that's helpful in knowing, these are the areas where they've seen an uptick in cases. So yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. April's here in Shakopee with me as well. And it hasn't been identified that we know of yet here anywhere in Scott County. And so I haven't heard of too many places like where you're at, Naomi, as to where it's really highly prevalent. But if it is, those areas need to take really high precautions. And so hopefully, have you talked to the city at all about that, Naomi, or with the DNR about your neighborhood? I mean, obviously it's been identified as somewhere that it is moving around, but have they engaged any other mitigation practices at all for your folks, or education components or anything like that?
Hi, this is Meg. I'm here with Naomi, and you were asking about like other education. I would say no. It has been entirely a grassroots effort from our like just random like Facebook administrators of the local gardening club. There's a group called St. Paul Perennial Exchange, which was very active, and the admins of that site, they contacted the extension biologists and they made the call that they were not going to allow any plant swapping posts at all this summer because the jumping worm situation. So they've been proactive, but yeah, I've been kind of hoping to see some kind of outreach campaign, like posters, social media things, something that people could share instead of everybody just having to like write their own. But it'd be great to see a little more, the DNR being a little more proactive in this, but it's going to be hard because jumping worms are still, it's totally legal to buy them.
Right.
Until their status is changed to a restricted invasive, it's going to be hard, and it's just kind of dependent on people like us to like step up and try to get the word out, but it's challenging when there's so little awareness.
Yeah, and for some context, we're actually both invasive species biologists, so this is like really frustrating for us. And like with our neighbors, you know, I saw a post the other day in a different neighborhood Facebook group that was someone saying, I have these, you know, plants for anybody who wants them. I put them in a bucket of water in case there are jumping worms. And I was kind of like, what is that supposed to do? I don't think that's going to do anything.
Right.
Like, so the message, you know, 1% of the message is getting through, but clearly not all of it. So I just kind of like, oh, it's rough. Yeah.
If this is something that, like, if there's an education component that I can help with, if this is something that would be helpful for if you have a neighborhood Facebook group or anything like that, if we want to like schedule to do something like this again, to teach all those folks, if it helps to have an outside person talk about things, I am more than happy to do this again for your neighborhood if that makes any sense. And we can absolutely help to spread the word and get more information out for folks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll be in touch. We can put out some feelers and see if we could schedule that with our local area. That would be awesome.
Yeah,
thank you.
Great.
Yeah, we could just do one for you guys. Would be perfectly fine. So that would be good. So yeah, so I haven't heard, like, that's the first time that I've heard of anybody having major, like, that level of infestations. It hasn't been reported anywhere. It hasn't been shared by the DNR when you look at the infestation logbooks and things like that. So it's really interesting. So I'm glad that you're here so I can know more about what you're experiencing and what you're doing, and might even stop by if you know of people who actually, do you have it in your yard?
No, well, not as far as we know. We've been vigilant. I mean, right. I guess I would say I don't know the extent of the invasion, especially because it's spring, but the fact that like noticeable numbers of people are reporting it makes us think it's like when you have mice in your kitchen, when you see one mouse, you know, there's many more.
You automatically assume like it's that scene from Ratatouille where all of the ceiling falls in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One situation that is, I find particularly appalling is the Ramsey County yard waste sites. So you can get free compost at almost all of them. And they say that it reaches a hot enough temperature that it kills pathogens and pests, which is okay. You know, you kind of have to trust some of these organizations. But at the one site in White Bear where people are allowed to take sod and soil, most of the yard waste sites don't accept dirt. It's only the one in White Bear. The place where people dispose of dirt is also the free dirt pile. So you've got everybody from Ramsey County and I'm sure around White Bear, no one's checking your address. All these people are coming and getting rid of their dirt from various projects. And then it's also the place where you go if you need free dirt. So it's just like this.
It's the same pile.
We're completely facilitating the spread of jumping worms in the metro area.
Right.
And I don't even know, I mean, I have a letter going to like my city council member. I don't even know like who for the county is in charge of that. I'm trying to find out, but I don't know what they would do because it's still, until the DNR starts to regulate this, it's going to be hard to really push for changes to practices like that.
Right. And so with like invasive species, different legislative things like that, with the DNR, a lot of them need legislative approval to like put them on the list and to do those kinds of things. It's a terrible, terrible system. But we had, she had to leave, but State Representative Jamie Becker Finn was on here for a little bit because she's a member of our group, and so she was here for the entire jumping worms section because she wanted to learn about that. Because she hasn't heard much about it herself, and so I'll talk with her and see how much she's really involved. She's on the environment committee, and so I'll talk to her about what, if anything, has been discussed at the legislative level at all.
That's fantastic. That's a great connection. That's good to know.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool.
Jane says, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I kind of have to get close to the screen so you guys get to look at my bald head. But the Ramsey County yard waste compost is also provided to the entire Roseville community garden of 100+ garden plots. So that's where she is. The representative actually is Roseville. So I'll make sure she knows that for sure. Good. Well, any other questions? Any other things that we can talk about? If everybody's lilacs are smelling gorgeous, tulips are starting to go down. Mine are starting to fade a little bit, which is the longest I think my tulips have ever stayed up happy. So it's good to see that. Does anybody have any fun garden things happening in their yard at all?
I am planting a pollinator garden in my boulevard. I live in Rochester.
Nice.
So, yeah, when I got stuff from the county, so I don't know how safe that is, I guess, but we'll see.
Yeah, all of that is grown with sterile potting soil, and so that sterile was the word that I was looking for earlier when I couldn't remember my words. But sterile potting soil has very, very little chance of having any sort of infestations of pretty much anything in it. So you'll be in okay shape from there for sure. So that is good. So Naomi says, so our hope is that the county compost sites are truly reaching 140 degrees, which they say it does. That should kill jumping worms and lots of other harmful things. Yep, exactly. We have here in Shakopee, we have the Shakopee Midwalk and Sioux. We also have a organics recycling facility here, and I've toured it many times, and I know they all kind of run similarly, but as long as it's well managed and you're comfortable with it being mostly well managed, they do a great job of making sure to do that, because the compost facilities especially, they have to get up to that temperature in order so you don't have bits of banana left over once you buy that compost from them, and they don't want that at all. So, for sure.
Brad, I was actually just going to ask that exact question about the Midwakaton Sioux Organics Recycling Facility, which I absolutely love. I love that it's right in our backyard, and they're really good about encouraging people to utilize it. But yeah, that was definitely a question about like what they're warming it up to make sure that it's killing off anything that could be potentially harmful.
Yep, if you notice, you go by there in the winter, especially like in the shoulder seasons of things, you'll see it steaming out there, and it's quite a ways off, and the pine trees are starting to grow up pretty tall around it now. But you can definitely see it steaming. It's doing its work, and it's really well run out there. I'm super proud of how they do that facility. So it's good stuff. So if you're concerned, you can come down to Shakopee to get some compost. It's really good stuff.
The other question I had, Brad, was with the controlled burns, just because I was thinking about the Midwakaton Sioux community here, but with controlled burns, whether it be here or wherever, is that something that also helps because it pulls out, it creates obviously high heat. Does that help with controlling some of that, or doesn't it affect them? Do they just kind of hide underground?
Yeah, I don't know if there's been The heat when you do a controlled burn doesn't actually get too high. It goes really, really fast, and so the ground doesn't heat up very much at all for controlled burns, which is why controlled burns are good, because they don't burn that crown on the perennials and the grasses and different things that are there. And so I don't know if that would have too much of an effect on it at all. I'm just looking for a picture here that I took out at the Arboretum the other day that I thought was really interesting, that I'd never really seen before. Here it is. See if I can share this. There we go. So at the Arboretum, if anybody goes to the Minnesota Arboretum, they had this is their grasses plot, and they did controlled burns on the grasses there just recently as well. And so they were and I'd never seen controlled burns done on ornamental grasses before, so I thought that was really a great way to handle those. But it doesn't get super hot in the soil, so I can't imagine that it would do a good job of effectively killing off jumping worms, even if they were just, a quarter, half inch under the soil.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you learned a lot about the old jumping worm and what's going on there. As we're going to do these about quarterly for different things, just in general for learning about different issues and going through things that are going on that are seasonal in nature. And so, but if anybody has something, if there's gardening, if you have local gardening clubs or neighborhood groups or different things like that, would love to chat with folks as we go there. Would also love for more folks to join our gardening club. We are going to, it's probably going to be about another 2 weeks, and then we're going to close it, and we're not going to let anybody else in after that, so we can really get a good vibe going on and figure out what's going on with what works best for everybody and what people want to learn about. So if you want to be one of the founding members and get on really shaping what that looks like so it can make most sense for you all, would love to have you there. I put the link there, and I'll also email it to everybody tonight so you have that as well. But would love to have people join and be part of that, so we can continue to grow the group and get more folks from across the state in there. So again, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. Any last questions that people want me to answer, you can always email me if you have other questions or want to talk about anything else. I'm available. So all right, awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Brad, this is very helpful.
I'm glad it was great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks. You guys too.